So now there's a new detail that's come with JJ's remains. And it was that they found JJ's body wrapped in garbage bags, but differently. His head was wrapped in a white garbage bag, and the rest of his body was wrapped all up, head included, in dark garbage bags. So it got us thinking, is it possible that the way that JJ died was due to that white trash bag, that white garbage bag? Was it possible he suffocated? And if so, your natural instinct is to claw it off. How could that maybe be abated? Could it have involved drugging? So I talked to Joseph Scott Morgan about that, and here's our conversation.
The first thing that jumps to mind, Ash, is the fact that JJ's body was wrapped in plastic, and that in and of itself is going to be a source for a wealth of information and evidence. You know, we've got things like latent fingerprints, hair, dead skin cells, which, you know, arises touch DNA, and people are thinking, well, the body was buried. You're going to have dirt on the outside. You're not going to have dirt on the inside potentially. So they have to be very, very careful when they're even removing the packaging that the body is in, because any disruption in that can disturb this very, very fragile evidence. And then beyond that, you know, you're going to be thinking from a kind of a chemical level relative to JJ. He did have the bag over his head, and you know, my thought is this a means in order to, say, for instance, suffocate JJ? I don't know, maybe so, but how do you get him to that point where you can place a bag over his head and kind of hold him in stasis, if you will, long enough to do that? That's where toxicology comes in.
Well, that was immediately what came to mind when I read the affidavit and saw there was a white plastic substance covering the child's head, but black plastic for the rest of the body. And anybody knows that you'll claw away at it if you can, and there'll be some sort of signs of struggle.
Yeah.
How would you try to avoid the signs of struggle? Would it be perhaps introducing a drug into the crime?
Yeah, you know, I was kind of opining about this my own way the other day, because during my career as a medical legal death investigator, I worked a number of cases that all stem from an organization or called the Hemlock Society. That a famous book was published called Final Exit. And this is kind of a society that believes in assisted suicide and what they refer to as self-deliverance. But one of the methodologies that they talk about with this is simply ingesting copious amounts of a substance like diphenhydramine, which you can find in sleep aids and NyQuil and those sorts of things, and then place a bag over your head so that you deprive yourself of oxygen. This is a respiratory depressant. I think that that's probably what we would be looking at, something that would slow heart rate, something that would compromise your ability to breathe. You place the bag over the head, that compromises replenishment of oxygen, and you have an anoxic death, which literally means that the brain is going to shut down because it's not being oxygenated. It's important to remember with this that, you know, the brain only makes up about, I don't know, 2% of our total body weight, but it requires roughly 15 to 20% of all the oxygen that's utilized in our bodies.
So the first thing that the layperson would think was, well, that would show up in an autopsy if there was some kind of drug introduced, especially into JJ, who was buried as a full body. He wasn't dismembered, he wasn't burned like the other child was, Tylee. That would show up, or would it?
Well, that's the trick, isn't it? Because let me tell you what we're dealing with. If you give somebody a substance to ingest, say a drink is laced with something, you inject them with something, you give a small child something to say, well, this is to make you feel better. Remember, JJ was used to taking medication. Of course, he hadn't been taking it like he should have, but this child was used to being given medication. So Lord only knows what he may have been given. But that aside, did you live long enough for the drugs to actually metabolize and to begin to break down? Or is there a half-life that's still going to exist in the drug? That is, does it exist in some form? Now, aside from that, we have to think about, you know, these bodies were buried for a protracted period of time. And as we all know, what's going on here is decomposition. So how much is decomposition going to impact any substance that was left in the body? That remains to be seen. Most of the time, people think, well, if you're talking about poisoning, we're going to think about heavy metals, and you can find that in the hair. Yeah, but do you realize how rare it is somebody actually gets poisoned with heavy metals? We hear about it, in the news and that sort of thing, and all kinds of dramatic tales. It's not that frequently. We're talking about arsenic and things like that. It just doesn't happen as frequently as you might think that it does.
So you bring up a fascinating part of this puzzle, and that is, how long was the child alive after the drug was introduced, and what's the half-life, and how quickly does that drug disappear? But the other side of the equation is, when you do an autopsy, everything in the blood doesn't just show up. You have to go hunting for specific things, and you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is key. Much of the public thinks that, well, we're going to do a toxicology panel, a postmortem toxicology panel. We'll find anything. No, you won't. There's a standard panel that you do from a postmortem perspective. And we're looking at things like opiates, diazepine. We're looking at even cannabinoids, THC. We're looking at blood ethanol. But if you start to talk about any kind of exotic poison out there, or even things that are, say, like diphenhydramine is actually what you would find many times in, say, for instance, like Benadryl. That will make you sleepy, that sort of thing. You find it in huge amounts in things like NyQuil, and the idea is to make you sleep in order so that your body can recover. It's also got an antihistamine in it. That's one of the things that causes the sleepiness. So are those things going to show up? Most of the time, they will not in a standard panel. You have to go looking for what's referred to as exotics. And there is a huge spectrum of these things. And then the toxicologists that are involved in cases like this have to take into account the problem of decomposition. And that's a very difficult puzzle to try to solve.
If nobody can find a specific drug to even look for, is there anything else that would happen to a body that would tell you maybe they were drugged and suffocated?
Yeah, one of the things that kind of strikes me in cases like this, and it can be comparable sometimes to drowning, if you will, the lungs will get particularly heavy as a result of some type of agent that somebody puts on board. It's a respiratory depressant. So the individual literally goes into like a congestive failure of their heart and their lungs. The lungs will actually take on more weight, fluid builds up, and you can appreciate this at autopsy. Again, we're back to this problem of decomposition, though, because the appearance of lungs, the weight of lungs can change as a result of that. So the forensic pathologist in this case is really going to have to take their time and examine this very, very carefully. That's why it's going to take a while for these results to come back, Ash.
Is it possible that if Tylee suffered the same fate as her brother and was suffocated with the same kind of plastic bags, that even after the perpetrator tried to char those remains, that there might be some evidence of that left over?
Yeah, there can be. I've actually seen cases where you will have bodies that are kind of cocooned in plastic, and on the unaffected side, let's say the side that is down, you can actually find remnant of the bag or the plastic on that side. It's kind of protected from the heat. In that sense, you can. But on the top side, if you're talking about applying fire to plastic, it's literally going to vaporize after a very short period of time. And again, this goes to how long was this fire tended? How long did they spend with the body trying to render the body down? I think that there is a possibility that some of the plastic could be removed because something was removed from that fire, from the fire pit, and placed in that grave. So you'd never know. That's why they were being so careful at the scene.
It's so fascinating to hear Joseph Scott Morgan talk about his work in death investigation as pertains to this case in particular, especially when you learn about standard panels versus exotic panels. And then there are those substances that are not in the exotic panels that you have to order and specifically test for. What's very interesting, though, is don't forget, we're talking about two children, right? We are also talking about Tammy Daybell. We are also talking about others. There are two other dead people in this story. And those are Lori Vallow Daybell's two ex-husbands, right? Those men were they were cremated, but that doesn't mean that their samples and tissues weren't left behind because they had autopsies, and so this could all pertain to them as well.